Hi, friends. Welcome to Raising Lifelong Learners. I'm your host, Colleen Kessler, and this is the podcast where I encourage you to trust yourself and your differently wired kiddos as you help cultivate their curiosity, encourage them to discover the world around them, embrace who they are wired to be, all while helping them discover their passions, interests, and raise them to become the amazing adults they're meant to be. Hey, welcome back. This is episode 203, and like I talked about last week in episode 202, we are going to have a second conversation about executive function skills. This time, though, I have a special guest with me. I'm super excited about this episode because it's been a while since I've had a guest on the show, and it was really fun to get back into kind of interview mode and chat with somebody. In fact, my guest today, Sarah Collins from the Homeschool OT, she is an occupational therapist and does a lot of work with families, especially homeschool families whose kiddos need occupational therapy in one way, shape, or another. And she's got a great background. So she and I talked about having her on a couple times in the coming months to talk about very different but specific areas where you might need occupational therapy or help. And the first of those topics that we're going to tackle today is executive function skills, because it is on my mind. It's on a lot of your minds because you're part of the Learners Lab. I know a whole bunch of you listeners are, and we're diving into executive function skills in the Learners Lab this month with the kids and the families. And so it's just been a great natural conversation to have on the podcast as well. So Sarah Collins is here with me to talk about executive functioning skills from an occupational / homeschooling perspective. So how we can glean from an OT and use those strategies and ideas in our own home. And again, she'll be back. We're going to talk in coming months about sensory processing challenges as well as fine motor skills, specifically with handwriting. But today, Sarah is here to talk about executive function skills. Before we get started, let me just get a quick shout out and thank CTC Math for all their support. They are a phenomenal sponsor. You'll hear more about them later in the show, but in the meantime, check them out. Keep them in mind if you're looking for a great math curriculum. Okay, pop those earbuds in. This is going to be a great episode. It was such a fun conversation to have, and I know you're going to love Sarah as much as I do. Let's get on with today's episode. All right, so I'm super excited to welcome Sarah Collins to the podcast. Hi, Sarah, welcome.
Hi, thank you so much for having me. This has been like a long time coming, right? And here we are finally.
Yeah, we've been talking about this probably for a couple of years, haven't we? Like in and out of email. And when we met last year at the Virginia Homeschool Conference, it's just our schedules have not come together, which anybody who's listening knows when you're parenting and homeschooling neurodiverse kids, it's hard to get schedules to align. So that's not really
so much so
surprising.
And so funny because that's actually kind of what we're talking about today is organization and planning and prioritizing. And that's exactly what we've had to do. So
Exactly. Okay, so why don't you take a quick minute and just tell us a little bit about yourself and just say hi to listeners so we know who we're talking to today.
Hello. So my name is Sarah Collins. I'm an occupational therapist and a homeschool mom, a fellow homeschool mom. We've been homeschooling. We're just finishing up our 6th year, which is so crazy. You know, when we started, we were starting actually in May of a school year, right? Because we were moving. And so I said, we'll just do this for a couple of weeks. And here we are 7 years later. So good stuff. My daughter just finished her freshman year of high school. And then I have a 12-year-old son and a 7-year-old son. So when we started, my youngest was 1. So we've done this through the whole gamut of toddlerhood and preschoolhood and all the way up now to starting high school, which is a whole new thing all in itself.
It is. Yeah, I have one that graduated, as you know, and then I have she's 10th grade this year going into 11th grade. And it's crazy because the younger ones, the oldest, we pulled him out in the middle of 1st grade. And so it's been an interesting experience. Like now the younger three having taken them all the way through and them not knowing anything different. But now we've
Yes.
got high school and junior high and elementary next year. Insane.
Yeah. It is so crazy. And it's funny to think, yeah, my youngest Reese, he has no idea what it's like to not be homeschooling, just this is his life. This is what he knows. And it's a different perspective. I think he has a different perspective than my older two that went in. Now, Caleb was only there for half of kindergarten before we moved, but Annabelle went all the way through fourth grade. Or was in part of fourth grade, but still, I mean, just a long time and different perspectives. So fun.
It's interesting. And then as we were talking about before, but we'll talk more here in this episode, homeschooling neurodivergent kids, it just adds another layer, right? There's so many people out there, especially newer homeschoolers, who are like, I can't do this because there are so many needs. But as we'll talk about, and as we've experienced personally, it's really the best thing you could do for your kids if they have any kind of special need or neurodiversity, because you get the opportunity to meet them where they are and move them forward in the way that is perfectly tailored towards them. And we've both, you and I, worked with kids in the school system, and the stuff that we can do with our own kids to help them out just far surpasses what anybody, any professional, any expert can do in a classroom.
Right. Absolutely. And I do talk a lot, like a homeschooling does not mean it has to be alone schooling. It just means that we get to build the team of people to help us. And so in our situation, we did end up going back into the public school system just for testing for my son, Caleb, what had happened. So at the point he was 8 and was not really reading still. And at that point, like I said, now I'm a whole different person. I think we all go through this of a kind of an evolution of our own homeschooling and what we worry about versus what we don't. At that point, I was just like, well, what am I doing? I'm clearly failing him. And I watched as he went to a friend's house, right? And they were having this club, and they had to be able to read the rules for the club to be able to be in, and he couldn't read them. And that's when he was just so frustrated and he was really sad. And I said, that, and as an OT, that's what we always look at is, when are you frustrated? When are you not able to do what you specifically need and want to do? And because he was so upset about it, I was like, this is not okay anymore. We have got to do something to figure this out a little bit more. And so that's when we went back in for some testing. But at that point, what they offered, which was wonderful, was a partial day, like Wilson reading program, which sounded great. But I was sitting in an IEP, and guys, again, I'm an occupational therapist. I've sat on that other side of the table. And the woman, I was like, tell me a little bit about what his classroom will look like. And she literally looked at me and said, well, the walls are blue. And I said, I know what a classroom looks. I mean, I should have changed my questioning, right? To not be so literal, but they just didn't even know what to do with us being homeschoolers. They didn't know what we would know. So anyway, long story short, the best things that we can do for our children is to be able to cater straight to them, and then to build the team of people that we need and that we feel like are going to support us in our desires and our children's desires. Every time I tell that story, I start laughing because this is the most ridiculous.
Yeah. It's so funny. And I think that so many of us who have had experiences with schools and then have gotten out have similar stories where we're like, okay, no, that's not actually what we're talking about.
And again, I could have phrased it differently, but seriously, you don't think I know what the classroom looks like.
I don't think the issue is with you there. I really don't. Oh my gosh. So interesting. Oh my goodness. Okay. So there's so many things. So for those of you listening, this is the first of a couple episodes that we're going to have Sarah on for, because there's so many different things that come into play when we're talking to an occupational therapist. And as homeschoolers who are homeschooling neurodivergent kids, OT comes into play in our lives for many of us with lots and lots of different diagnoses. And I think that it's important to explore those different areas. And so when I talked to Sarah about coming on, I figured, and I think rightfully so, that if we just talked about general occupational therapy, we would be talking for like 7 hours.
Yeah, for
And
forever, right?
yeah, and so we're breaking things down because I think so. I know based on the conversations that I have with my own audience that one of the big questions is, well, when do I get tested, or when do I go see an occupational
Mm-hmm.
therapist, or when do I go, for this, that, or the other? And like Sarah said, it's very personal, and it
Yeah.
comes down to how whatever the issue is affecting your child.
Yes.
And when it kind of like becomes pervasive and the things that you've tried are no longer helping. So when we're looking at when to get assessed and what to get assessed for, I've said before to people who have asked me directly, I think occupational therapy for kids who are neurodivergent is a great first step because the evaluation process is so holistic and takes into account so many different aspects of a kid's being that they can tease out lots of different things like sensory processing disorder, like autism spectrum disorder, like fine motor skills and potential
Yeah.
dyslexia and dysgraphia. And there's so many different things that they can find. But the bottom line comes in to when to do it is related directly to how is this affecting your kid's self-esteem? How is it affecting how you can meet their needs? And is it more global than like specific to one area of their life? And
Right.
so when we're talking over the next few episodes, we're going to be talking about sensory processing. We're going to be talking about handwriting specifically and fine motor skills. Today, though, we're going to be building off of the episode from last week. Last week in episode 202, we talked about executive function skills, and I gave you a really quick general overview on executive function skills, what they are and what they look like, and what you might be able to do kind of quickly to help in different areas. And Sarah and I are going to dive a little bit deeper into that and talk about some things from an OT perspective when it comes to executive function skills. So before we kind of dive into that, Sarah, can you give us like in a nutshell, what executive function skills are?
Sure. So executive functioning skills are actually involved in almost every single thing that we do. So because to get started with something, that's task initiation, that's executive functioning skills. To continue your task, right? That's perseverance or persistence. So that goes all the way through. And we have to know when to stop, and we have to self-evaluate how well we did through that. So every single task that we're doing requires executive functioning skills. Now, the tricky thing is that they're mostly lodged in the frontal lobe of the brain, right? So that is one of the last portions of the brain to fully develop. And we also know that the brain is what we call plastic or malleable. So meaning that it's going to be forming different connections as our life goes on. So even up through adulthood and through older adulthood, we don't stop learning. We don't stop making connections. So with that, what we have to do is to be able to look at what a person's current skills are right now, what it is that their environment needs, or their environment is demanding, and then what it is that they need and want to do. So the way I refer to that, it's the person, the environment, and the occupation, or how you're occupying your time. So it really is finding a balance or a mesh of all of those things together. And that's how we have quote unquote success in our activities.
I love that. I love the first bringing in the neuroplasticity of the brain and then how you tie all those things in together. And I think it's important, especially when we're talking to gifted and twice exceptional kids, to bring in some of that kind of science information. I know a lot of kids who are very bright do better with their own struggles and then the learning that needs to take place to overcome those struggles when they understand what their brain or their body is doing.
Why, right?
Yeah. And so when you're talking to your kids about what's going on, and this is why when people ask me, should I label my kid, or I don't want to label, or they say, I don't want to label my kid, I don't want to get them identified because they're going to be stuck with this label. The truth of the matter is your kid is labeling themselves, right? They're labeling themselves as dumb or broken or bad or whatever. And so let's give them tools and let's give them labels, even if it's not the specific label like sensory processing disorder or ADHD or something. Let's let them know their brain is wired in a way that makes it a little bit more difficult to initiate tasks and follow through, and then help them understand that their brain is plastic and
Yes.
they can take advantage of that neuroplasticity to retrain their brain to do things. And here are some ways to retrain their brain. So I love that you brought that up.
Absolutely. And there's so many times that my son and I, we talk about, and this is part of executive functioning, is that self-evaluation, or quote unquote metacognition is another word for that. But at the end of the day, I'll say, what did you learn about your own brain? Really. And this year specifically, so he's just finishing up 6th grade, but there was one day that I will just vividly remember. I wrote the date down in my little journal and I was like, this is it. Like, we're hitting it, where at the end, he had been writing an essay on something. I tell you, I have it ingrained in my brain, but I don't even remember what the essay was on. So maybe I just have a piece of it ingrained in my brain. but it was at the very end of it. And every time I have him write something, my last little portion is, and what did you learn about yourself in it? And he said, today I learned I cannot just sit. Right. And so I was like, I've known that about you for a long time, buddy, but I'm glad that you learned that about yourself. And he said he learned that he needed to take breaks. He needed to get up. He needed to be able to jump. And we talk about this all of the time with him, because what he craves is a lot of proprioception to help to calm and organize his body. But that metacognition, him understanding that about himself, was more important than anything that he's writing. Because he can do that for the rest of his life if he can advocate for himself of, I'll be great in this meeting, just whatever, I'm going to bring this and this TheraBand and I'm going to pull on it or whatever, because he knows that about himself. And that self-awareness is huge.
Yeah. I don't think we can underestimate the importance of that. I remember very vividly, actually, kind of like your story, when we first started seeing a psychologist. I think Trevor was like 7. Okay. Perspective. He's 20 now.
Yeah.
And
right.
21 in November. And after she talked to him for her first, so the first appointment was like us talking, and then her talking to him, and then all of us talking. And when we all came back together, her first statement was, he is one of the most metacognitive 7-year-olds I've ever experienced, because he could tell her what he was feeling and why he thought he was feeling that. He couldn't control the impulsivity. He couldn't control some of his behaviors. He couldn't control the interruptions, but he knew he couldn't. And he knew what he could do better. And he knew what kinds of things helped him. And that's something that we continue to strive for as we grow, as the kids grow. And it's so important because of, like you said, that self-advocacy. These kids go, in fact, that has translated. He took a college class, an English class, and went up to the professor at the end of the class and said, I really struggle to do that handwriting. I can't an essay in class. Like those around me were filling pages and I filled a paragraph because I've always used talk to text or typing because of my fine motor skills. And she was like, okay, bring a tablet with the keyboard. And, being able to articulate why, like, I'm not making excuses for myself. This is a struggle for me. And here's how I've accommodated my own struggles. Is there a way for you to accommodate that in the classroom? And those are life skills. And
so long into our life. I mean, it's not like that ends, that as soon as, I'm self-aware now, and I'm never going to need to advocate for this anymore. That awareness doesn't take away the struggle, but instead it does allow for that accommodations. So if we can be talking about it with our children of, this is the way that your brain is wired, and it's not wrong and it's not broken, but what we can do is help you to fit in with the environment that you are going to be in at that moment and what you need and want to do. So it might be that, sure, maybe this isn't the correct environment, or maybe this isn't the correct, again, occupation or how you occupy your time. So we can make adjustments to those. But without that self-awareness, you can't do any of that.
Right. Absolutely. Okay. So let's dive in a little bit here. And from the perspective, okay, so your website is Homeschool OT. So let's talk a little bit about that, as from the perspective of both a parent who's homeschooling her kids who are neurodivergent and an occupational therapist. What are some things that very specifically that parents can put into play immediately if their kids are struggling with executive function skills? Now, I know there's a bunch of executive function skills, so explaining exactly what they are is difficult. However, most parents who are coming to either of us for help with executive
Mhm.
function skills are talking about organization and planning and
Yep.
task initiation and impulsivity and stuff like that.
Mhm.
So
Mhm.
we know that that's the first thing that they need to manage and advocate for and whatever. And so what are some things that we could do today to start, I don't know, improving our homeschool and thus our relationship with our kids?
Yes. Oh, that's so important. That's actually the biggest piece, I think, is our relationship, because our kids need to know that we trust them, and that we're not just saying you need to be organized and you need to be, plan and prioritize yourself, that they're not being shamed or they're not feeling guilty or shame about what they can and cannot do, but yeah, that we're coming alongside of them. And so I think those conversations, especially at the end of an activity or an assignment or just like a hockey game, of what did you do really well? What did you not do well? How can that change? That influences that metacognition. And that's one of the pieces that we talked about. But the planning and prioritization and organization, there needs to be a mesh within, again, the person, the environment, and that occupation. So here's an example. My daughter, God love her, is not the best at setting up her day, right? So she knows when kind of things are due or done, but is not always the best at planning out and giving herself enough time. So that's the time management piece. So we've looked at a couple of different things to try to help, whether we're going to use technology or whether we're going to not, paper planners versus technology. For her, actually, we ended up using Trello. And what we do is sit down at the very beginning of the week and we write out kind of what is it that my expectations are, right? So laying out our expectations, whether they come from us or whether they come from her, the majority of the time, the expectations come more from her than they do for me. Things just like she's in theater. I know you and I have talked about this a lot because both of our girls are in theater. She also plays volleyball. So those are the things that like we have to do, right? You have to be there at a certain time. You have to make your audition or your vocal lesson or your volleyball practice or whatever. These things have to happen at a certain time. And then we kind of reverse plan from there. So then what else needs to happen within that day? We practice this. And so that's the, setting up your expectations. We practice it in a couple of ways. One, by following the schedule or whatever that we've laid out at the beginning of the week, but also we practice it by just some loose things of time management that she needs to do. So, for example, she is in charge of washing our breakfast dishes every day. If she doesn't wash our breakfast dishes, and then there's lunch dishes, then she has to wash the breakfast dishes and the lunch dishes, right? It's some natural kind of consequences in there. But she makes that decision. She can say, all right, I'm going to do this, or I'm not. And if she has a hard time getting started, that's something that I can tell as her mom, where I can say, all right, I can see that you're having a hard time getting started here. And I use that term a lot. I can see, because it's, one of my observations. And so I want to make sure that I can explain that to them. This is what I'm seeing right now, but my observation might not necessarily be correct. Like one day I was like, Belle, I can see that you're having a hard time getting started. And she was like, oh, no, I'm not. I just decided I'm going to do it after lunch because this is my other priority. Great, fine. So actually what I was observing was not correct, but she could, again, advocate. So having some times where they have to, or setting them up so that they are able to practice those skills, but then also allowing her to self-advocate in that time has been really key for her to kind of take that ownership over her own time management and planning and prioritization.
I love that, actually. Yeah, no, I want to piggyback on that real quick because I love that piece right there. I can see, and then being able to have the give and take for two reasons. One, you had a little bit of, in that particular example, metacognition involved right in it. No, I'm actually not. She was thinking about her own thinking and what she was doing and then able to articulate it. But on top of that, we have that differentiation that I think is so hard for us as parents between behaviors and feelings, right? Behavior is a choice, even if the choice to behave in a certain way is more difficult for some than others. I used to say to my kids all the time, especially my oldest, who was very impulsive, and
Mhm.
very classically ADHD or
Mhm.
struggling with psychomotor overexcitabilities, that we're going to family gathering or wherever it is we're going, it's going to be much more difficult for you to not just grab or take or do than
Right.
it is for your siblings or your cousins, but it doesn't make it less important for you to be able
Yes.
to behave in that way. It's still the choice you need to make, but that choice is a lot harder for you,
Mhm.
especially in a situation where there's overwhelm. So we need to pre-plan for that. What can
Yep.
we
Lay
do
out
to
those
make that
expectations,
choice?
right?
Right.
Yes.
And
And your
so
options.
that
Ooh, yeah.
that idea of, what you're feeling and what's easy for you versus difficult for you in conjunction with how we still need to behave. Because, like I
Mhm.
would say to my kids in a very extreme example, even if, being on time for something is more difficult for me and I'm running late for something, I still don't have the right to run a red light or
Right.
speed on the highway or wherever, because the laws say that I have to behave within certain parameters. And our social norms say that in order to keep everybody safe around us and have everybody who's there have a good time, we need to behave in certain ways.
Yeah.
And it's not appropriate to push somebody out of your way or talk over people. And so we still do need to learn those things, even if they're more
Mhm.
difficult for us.
Yeah.
And so I love that behavior is still a choice to do the breakfast dishes or to be stuck doing breakfast and lunch because
And lunch
I
dishes, right?
chose not to do it when I
Mhm.
was supposed to do it.
Yeah. And it gives that autonomy as well because she can make that choice. But I also put in there that as she's making those choices, she's really weighing out so many other parts of her day that, I'm not always privy to. And so,
Right.
and just because something is hard for her now, like as she's had practice, she's gotten better. She can now manage her time a little bit better. Like we modeled the environment, we set up other occupations for her to practice, right? And so that has improved. So thinking it's something for you that's hard now doesn't mean it's always going to be
Right.
hard. So I think that is a big piece that comes along with that metacognition. Like I have learned this about myself for now, and even when we were talking about my son who learned like I right now sitting for me is really hard, and I need to have lots and lots of breaks. And I gave the example of, yeah, sure, maybe he'll need to advocate for that in the future at, with his meeting or whatever. But maybe he won't because he also, again, the brain is plastic and he is continuously learning not only executive functioning wise, but learning sensory processing wise. And like we just are forever making changes within
Mhm.
our brains. So things that are hard now don't necessarily always have to be hard.
Yeah, I think that's so important to remember as parents because especially homeschooling parents, because we're so in the thick of it that it's
Mm-hmm.
hard to see, to use a cliche, the forest for the trees, because we're
Yeah.
so buried by all the leaves and the branches and
Yes.
everything else. We can't see further down the path, and we're not supposed to.
Right.
So we don't get a break. We don't get the glimpses as easily as others do because we
Right.
don't have that separation. And so it's important for us to remember that kids grow and they change and they
Yes.
mature. And the kid
Right.
that you would meet if you came to a convention, the 20-year-old who's running my booth, is not the same kid you would have met when he was 12 in my booth
Right.
helping out. And
Yeah.
that's because of the growth that he's had and the
Yes.
advocacy that he's learned and the small incremental steps that we've done
Yep.
over the years to help him understand his own brain and move forward. So this is a baby step kind of
Yes.
process. Like these are things you can do right now, these
Mm-hmm.
conversations and this teaching, but you're not necessarily going to see the yield for years, and it's
Years.
okay. Trust
Mm-hmm.
yourself and trust the process, right?
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. Absolutely. Trust that through those years that, yeah, you're probably not seeing the incremental changes, but they're there and
Yes.
they're happening. And if you take the time to look back, then you're going to be like, oh, right, right.
Mhm.
That's where we were. This is where we are now. Not that right now is easy,
Right.
because really is any life ever totally easy? No.
Uh,
But but in perspective, easier than it
right.
was.
Hey there. Okay, I want to take a quick minute and talk to you about CTC Next. So CTC Math, our sponsor for this season, is the math program that we have chosen to use for our own kids this year. And actually, we've been using it for the last couple years. And one of the reasons we switched math programs over to CTC Math exclusively is because it allows extreme flexibility. I love, love, love all of the openness that it offers to us as a family of differently wired kids. We've got kids in our family who have just taken off in math super quickly and have always had an aptitude for it. And we've had kids in our family who have not been really strong math kids. And the CTC Math program is set up in a way that allows for us to meet the needs of each of those individual kids without buying a bunch of different programs or levels. I love that when you subscribe to CTC Math, you get access to K to 12 math levels. You have the ability to skip around. You can move forward or move back as often as you want. And parents have really great controls and get good reports. So I love that I can go in and I can set my expectations for my kids. So my kiddo who's super strong in math right now, I can set it so that in order for him to move on to the next lesson, he needs to get a 90% or higher, because his biggest failing in math is speeding through it and making careless mistakes. So I want to make sure he slows down and he takes his time, because when he does slow down and take his time, he gets the answers correct, usually on his first time through. But for my kiddos who struggle a little bit with math, I want to make sure that they're feeling empowered and they're feeling successful. So I'm able to set their expectation closer to 80 or 85%. That way they're more able to be successful the first time through a new math concept than they would if I set it to 90 or 95%. It gives you the opportunity to customize it for your kids in the way that works best for them individually and not just as a whole. The other thing I like is the weekly reports that I get an email every single week that lets me know how many times my kids logged on, how many lessons they completed, what their percentage was overall, and a general idea of how they're doing. And then I can click through if I want, and I can get a better breakdown of the exact areas in which they had issues or the areas in which they were super successful. So I can adjust if I need to, or I can meet with them to make sure that they're understanding concepts. Such a flexible program with so many great little pieces to it that I just love recommending it to anybody who's looking for a math program that's flexible enough to work with all different types of kids and is affordable and user-friendly. So check them out at ctcmath.com. Let them know that we sent you from the Raising Lifelong Learners podcast, and let's get back to the episode.
So if there's one takeaway that I could say from this, is that we need to think of our kids as who they are now in the moment and try to adapt to what they need right now, but recognize that it's not always going to be that way for the future. And so changes in our environment now and providing those options to practice. Like I know you mentioned before, games that can help with working memory, and those same games that can be helping, as far as flexible thinking or task initiation, like giving these options to practice. That's not what they're always going to need. We can expect that there's going to be growth and change.
Yeah, I love that. Okay, so before we go, tell us, you have an offer for readers or for listeners, readers too.
And readers, right?
The site and you're looking at this on the site, you can still take advantage of it. But for listeners, Sarah has some really great resources at homeschoolot.com. She's got a couple other links that I'm going to make sure that we put in the show notes. But why don't you tell us about both of the offers that you have?
Yeah. So as far as executive functioning goes, I have two things. One, I have a focus group, which is a month-long deep dive into executive functioning. And we break down each of the skills. So I use the model from Smart but Scattered. You and I were talking about this before, that you can Google executive functioning skills. And sometimes people are like, there's 2, and sometimes there's 11. And so I use the model for Smart but Scattered because it's helpful within the group to also have a book to refer back to. So they talk about 11 executive functioning skills. And so through the group, I go into breaking it down to how do we help our kids build these specific skills? How, if they are struggling with that specific skill, do we adapt the environment? And what are some games or activities or other ways, other occupations that we can be using to help to build those skills and for each and every one. So that is the focus group. The other thing that I have in there is a book guide for the book Hatchet. It is a lot easier when we're trying to directly teach our children about executive functioning skills to look at them in another person. We want to talk about shared metacognition and self-evaluation. We've talked about that a lot today. But if we're looking at it within book characters, we can recognize, Brian, he really struggled with task initiation when he was really stressed. And why would that be? But yet he didn't when he was getting good sleep and good food once he figured out his own nutrition while he was in the forest or whatever. And if you haven't read Hatchet before, it's a remarkable book.
Yeah, it's a great book.
Yeah. And this poor guy who was flying and then his plane crashes and then he has to survive with only a hatchet. So clearly he's going to have to use a lot of executive functioning skills, flexible thinking throughout, working memory, organization. Even at one point, if all you have is the clothes on your back and your hatchet, you can't lose it.
Right.
And then, so it talks about all of that throughout. So both of those are on my website, and they have, if you use the code, what do we say, RLL 15 to get 15% off of any of those things.
Perfect. So I'll link to that in the show notes too, and I'll put a reminder of the coupon code. But if you go to Sarah's site and into the shop portion of it, and as we're talking here, she's in the process of not reevaluating, but redesigning the site. So you'll still be able to get to it even after the site is redesigned. It just will look a little bit different. So the links, we'll change the links when we need to. But if you use the coupon code RLL15 on either of those, the focus group, if you want to join and have a deep dive, if your kids are really struggling with that and you're struggling to meet your kids where they are and find out exactly how to help them in the different areas, or if you want to get started with something like a book guide, a unit study type thing, that would be a really great one. In fact, I'm thinking about doing that with my two youngest kids. When you were talking about it, I was like, I haven't read that book with them yet. So that would be a really good one to do with my 13 and 10-year-olds.
Yes.
So anyway, I am so grateful, Sarah, that you came on today, and I'm looking forward to our other conversations.
Me too.
So thank you. I appreciate you so much.
You're welcome. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, this was fun. And so those of you listening, thank you so much for joining us. I know there's lots and lots of different places that you can spend your time, and I'm so grateful that you come and you spend your time here with me every week. And we'll be back same time, same place next week with another episode on another topic related to homeschooling your neurodivergent kid. But in the meantime, you can go over to the show notes for this episode, raisinglifelonglearners.com/podcast. And you can find links to all the resources that Sarah and I talked about. You can also find links to the previous episode 202, where I talk about the different executive function skills, and anything else that I find in the next week or so related to executive function skills that might help you a little bit more, along with links to all of Sarah's resources as well. So thank you so much for being here. I appreciate you. Enjoy your kids this week, and I will see you next week. Bye for now.